I know we all have a lot of interesting discussions, but we would like to start the first panel now. My name is Elaine Finellis. I'm a student of linguistics, MPhil student, here at UWI Mona. For our first panel this morning, our first speaker is Dr. Nakisha Dawkins, coming to us from UWI Cave Hill, with specialty in phonology, phonetics, sociophonetics, and sociolinguistics. And her topic for this morning is styling through rhyming, investigating vowel variation in Jamaican dancehall lyrics. Please welcome Dr. Dawkins.
Good morning. I'm sure most of you in the audience, you're familiar with my work. I've presented on it so many times, especially Prof. You're supposed to be real familiar with it. Probably can recite it from memory, right, Prof? Because over the years, I've been self-inviting myself into Professor Devenish's office to pick his brain, because once upon a time, we thought he was on my supervisory committee, and then about 3 years into my thesis, we found out he wasn't, but that didn't change anything because I still sought advice from him. When I came to UWI, the intention was just to get a first degree and leave. But then I sat next to Professor Devonish on a flight to Curacao for my Creole Linguistics field trip, which is a part of the course. And then he said to me, "Have you ever considered graduate studies?" And then and then he started to sell it to me, and you know what happened, I'm here, right? So he's very influential in my career as a linguist and in helping me, along with my supervisor, Dr. Rocky Mead, in achieving this PhD, the PhD I earned 2 years ago, right? And I want to say thank you, Prof. So now, let me get straight into the presentation. Human beings tend to associate certain concepts with maleness and femaleness, and it's the same way we associate certain linguistic items with masculinity and femininity, and some language features are attributed to men and some are attributed to women. The major task of this presentation is to explain the acoustic features that are involved in the styling of Jamaican dancehall lyrics, particularly the chorus of the song. What is dancehall? I'm sure most of you have heard the music, the sound, seen a lot of the artists performing, but let's look at what the literature says. Devonish 1998 defines dancehall as an art form involving the delivery of spoken language to a predetermined rhythmic pattern established by an accompanying recorded bass and rhythm soundtrack, right? So how did dancehall start? According to Hope, in the early 1980s, the dislodged youths in the inner cities of Kingston needed some sort of safety valve in which to release their pent-up frustrations. And dancehall music was a response to this. It is what she calls a cultural product, musical product, that is embedded in Jamaica's economic, social, and political happenings. Now, you would have seen a lot of these images if you turn on your TV or you've looked at any YouTube videos involving dancehall. Dancehall is about style. There's a certain style of dressing, there's a style of dancing, as well as there's what I propose to be a certain phonetic style that we'll look at later. Now, initially, I claimed when I just started the thesis that within dancehall, men will produce more songs with their chorus filled with syllables that had more back and low vowels, and women would use more words containing syllables with high front vowels. And I looked at this part of the study as the production of vowels. Although I found that this was the case, there was more to the music that the data was showing me. So I decided to look at vowel variation. What would happen if artists produce the same vowels in the same phonetic environment, that is the same words, right? So the vowels I looked at are in monosyllabic words like man, you, me, and me, which tend to fall in syllable final position in terms of the line final position of the chorus. So, and I remember going through Professor Devanish's work, and he explained the importance of the rhyming syllables in Jamaican dancehall, and he used Buju Banton's How Master God Whirl Around as an example. So I said, you know what, let me explore the variation aspect of this. Now, let me just, for those of you who are non-linguists, I don't know if there's any in the room, let me explain what, I'm sorry. Back vowels and low vowels. Some examples of these are like, this is a low vowel because your tongue is lower in your mouth, and it's also called open because your mouth is more open when you produce a versus an e, which is a high vowel. And these are also front vowels. And the back vowels are like o and u and oo, right? So this is Terra Fabulous singing Position.
So I'm gonna stop saying position. All of the girls, them watch this. Cock up, watch this. Cock up, position. Hold up your head and cock up your bottom. Hold on to the bed dead and hold on strong. Screaming and moaning the thing say a storm. But you have to request the work me pop on Jennifer and
So that's the chorus, and he's using the open or low front unrounded vowel, position, right? And this is Lady Saw.
Some boy can't please me. Them just not ready. No know if to flog me. If you start it, check me. Baby, are you up for this? Give me all that slamming so that I can turn on this. Me know we not no long talking. I am feeling hot tonight. Me ready for the bump and grind. Put me on your feet in the bike. Yes.
Okay, and here's a Beanie Man.
well, this is like a menace to the society. Big enough for all the ghetto lady. All girls, knock out and go crazy. Busy, sing along shop. Give me the girl, let me the wickedest slum. The kind of girl we no feel love up, she man. Man, if you want to get the medal, you have to get a slum from a real ghetto girl again. Give me the girl, let me the wickedest slum.
Okay, so I looked at vowel production, as I said initially, but wanted to explore vowel variation because I wanted to know when these vowels are used, what social factors might influence the use of a particular vowel. First, with my very naive mind, I started out thinking maybe it's something physical, but even though the literature looked at the physical differences between men and women, that couldn't account for the variation alone. And then I found literature that explored the fact that social factors influence vowel variation more than physical factors. So I looked at the audience and the topic, right? So I would notice that the artist would use a particular linguistic style when the topic and the audience were associated with a particular gender. So more back and low vowels were used to target male or issues of masculinity, and more high front vowels and high mid front vowels were used to target women and issues of femininity. Now, as it relates to vowel variation, Tor Jensen looked at the vowel O, the high back rounded lax vowel in the word foot, and found that girls tend to front the back vowel more than boys within that society. Also, thought had similar findings, but not only with gender, but also with a person's social class. So once you were from the working class and you were female, you fronted your vowels more than men. Miller and Milroy, in their Belfast study, found that women led in the fronting and raising of the a and e vowels. Now, move this. I wanted to see within dancehall what type of space was this. Could it be that this is not a male-female thing, but maybe the type of subculture of dancehall, the setting of dancehall? Is dancehall a masculine arena? Is this a community of practice where in which there's a linguistic style, a masculine linguistic style associated with this community, and those who wish to be a part of the community coming in would have to conform to this linguistic style? Now, within dancehall, men are the main artists. They outnumber women, far outnumber women. They're the promoters of shows, they're the producers of shows, they're the engineers playing the music. They are just very dominant in dancehall and tend to be regarded as being more prestigious. They earn more than women. Even if a woman has the biggest song in the industry at any particular time, she earns less. And I remember interviewing dancehall promoter Isaiah Leng and Heavy D Fraser, Junior Heavy D Fraser, who told me that, Jem, even if a woman sang a down the place, she could have been number one on the chart. Me nah give her more money for perform a sing than a man. Right? He told me that. And then when I interviewed artists like Sizzla, he's like, you know, dancehall is rough and tough. Woman can't come in a dancehall and sing the things them when man sing about. So dancehall is more masculine. Women can't sing about the same type of things. So men have more freedom in terms of their lyrical content, and women are more restricted to sing about the other woman or what their bodies can do. Right? Their sexual prowess, how good they are in bed, or, you know, all these things. But men can sing about politics, guns, women, sex, having more than one woman. So the topics are more, there are a wider range of topics for men in dancehall than women. So again, within dancehall, there's this style of dress and dance, and I wanted to learn more about the linguistic style. According to Bell, style is essentially speakers' response to their audience. So I see the use of vowels being used in relation to a particular audience and particular topic, right? And I wanted to know, in the methodology, I wanted to explore how does one determine who the audience is? So what I did, I got the panel of experts, Dr. Donna Hope, Sonia Nair, interviewed artists and promoters, and I would play the lyrics of songs, or I would ask them, who do you think can benefit from such a song? And they would say, you know, are the man them tune this, or the girl them tune this, or this is targeting men, this is targeting women, or a general audience, both men and women can benefit. Usually the songs that target a general audience, men and women, tend to be about political issues, right? But in terms of sexual prowess, a man could be talking about the amount of woman he has, reinforcing his masculinity by bashing homosexuality, which is very common in Jamaican dancehall. So I looked at a total of 120 songs for the variation part of the study. So I looked at the words man, me, and you. And I looked at what a male artist would do with the same vowel in the same phonetic environment, the same word, in a song that targeted a man versus a woman. And what I found, well, I'm here, Joseph's showing me the card. For example, Beenie Man here is targeting Bounty Killer in this rival song, where they were added in the late 1990s, and Beenie Man addressed Bounty Killer in this song called Boy Stop Live Down in the Past. And I want you to take note of the vowels in rhyming position.
Hey, boy, stop live down in the past. Stop remember when man a ride us. Now you dead don't mean you're so lost. Crush like a serpent snake on the cross.
Okay. So here, the angel is singing to her then husband, Beenie Man, and he sings back to her, and I want you to notice the type of vowels used in the rhyming syllables. Oh, I did not go back.
My youth, you are my first man.
Remember we married.
That make you my husband.
Why you say?
Me a make me suggestion.
Why?
I mean, no matter which fool want respond.
Baby, you are my first lady.
Me are your queen.
Because you have me baby. Oh, no. Not if but maybe.
Okay, so as I said during the production part of the study, it showed here that men produce more rhyming syllables with low and back vowels, and these targeted men or issues of masculinity mostly, and women produced more songs with high front vowels, and these address females and issues of femininity. Now, as it relates to what men do when singing to men, for example, the pitch of their voice, I looked at pitch, the height, and the fronting and backing of vowels. Men tend to use higher pitch when singing to women or addressing female-like issues, and a lower pitch when singing to men and male-like issues. So this is an example of Capletons in More Hot Girl for Me.
Girl time, girl time, girl time, hot girl time, hot girl time, hot girl time, hot girl time, them looking fine. Hot girl for me, hot girl me say, hot girl for me, hot girl me.
So now I want you to look at a Pratt picture, right? Pratt is the computer software used to analyze speech sound, and what I've done is I've captured the center of the vowel, which I measured for all the vowels, the center of the vowel. So this is the I vowel in a song targeting males, and his hertz for that is 55.87. And for the one targeting women, it's a higher pitch, 270.99 hertz. How women sing to men versus how women sing to women. When women sang to women, they used a higher pitch, and when they sang to men, they used a lower pitch. Here is an example of Lady Saw singing a song saying "Them no like me" to females. Like, I'm only playing one song because of time.
I want to miss bad mind, and I want to miss a bad mind. Wow, them no want to see me shine. Them want me stop shine. Them no like me know say them no like me. See them a fight me see say them a fight me. Them want fight me, the whole of them.
Okay, so for the song Ninja Bike that targets men, I captured the pitch of the vowel, which is 95.31 hertz, and she uses a higher pitch in the song that's targeting women, and she's saying these women don't like her, 433.14 hertz, so she produces a higher pitch in that song. So we're looking at the same vowel, the same phonetic environment, but being addressed, she's addressing different audience member. I looked at the statistical significance of the results of the findings, and it showed that in the case of pitch, using a higher pitch when targeting a particular audience, it found that the data was statistically significant. Now, as it relates to vowel height, the higher the value of the hertz is, the lower the vowel, and the lower the value of the hertz is the higher the vowel. Now, for men, they tend to have an average of 767 hertz, right, on their vowels when they're targeting men, which means that they produce the vowels lower, versus when targeting women, they produce the vowels higher. And for women, they produce their vowels lower when targeting men and higher when targeting women. So therefore, the tongue is higher in the vocal cavity and lower in the vocal cavity. So when targeting men, the tongue is lower. When targeting women, the tongue is higher. Now, so the data also proved to be statistically significant. Now, as it relates to fronting, for the men, because even though men fronted more when targeting women and back more when targeting men, it was not so significant because the figures are quite close, as you can see. And for women, they fronted more for women and back more for men. But again, it was not so significant, right? For the men, the findings in terms of fronting and backing were not statistically significant, but the data, even though the numbers were not that significant in terms of what's here, when I performed the chi-square test for the women, the data in terms of fronting more for issues dealing with femininity and targeting women, it was statistically significant. Now, after careful examination of the data, a clear pattern emerges that there's a linguistic style associated with the delivery of dancehall lyrics. So although vowel production is important, the more important aspect is the vowel variation. So even though the gender of the artist is also important, what is more important is the gender of the target audience. And my conclusion is that in Jamaican dancehall music, there's a unique pattern, a unique style, which I refer to as a phonetic style. And this could be, as I said, associated with this culture of masculinity. I know, Joseph. With this culture, that's why I skipped over a lot of the prose. A culture of masculinity. So, because masculinity, according to Connor, is not a feature that's attributed to males alone, because women are capable of being performers of masculinity, and dancehall, I argue, is this masculine arena, and women, just like men, are able to perform masculine features. They're able to take on this element of power within this very powerful musical arena. And even though within the literature there are differences between men and women, and it's really differences that excites us according to quotes, but there are similarities, and sometimes these similarities need to be emphasized.
Thank you, Dr. Dawkins. We will now open up the floor for questions. 10 minutes, please.
So thanks, Nikisha.
You're welcome.
Interesting presentation as usual. Two things. First, a comment and invitation.
Invitation.
Invitation, yes. There's something happening that I am calling the Great Kingston Vowel Shift. And that's lowering of vowels taking place. One Hubert Devonish says it's a male-dominated thing. We don't know that yet. But I'm inviting you to come and let us study what exactly is happening. So this is the lowering of vowels like E to A.
I would
so
love
instead
to.
of free, free, instead of boot, bought, and so on. Also, generally, I think, is that powerless groups have to be more linguistically dexterous. So that's where you would find the highest variation, because they need to be able to talk to everybody else. Those with the power generally just need one variety, and everybody else accommodates to them. But you're finding, if I understand you, that men are producing, men have more variation going on than women in dancehall.
No. What happened is that dancehall is already considered a masculine arena.
Yeah,
so those entering need to conform to the linguistic style that is high status. So it's already dominated by men. So women coming in would then do the same things.
So I guess what I was asking, there was something that you had where the men were doing two things, but the women only one.
Okay, is that the fronting where it was not statistically significant?
Yes, I think that might have been it.
So women fronted more than men. But even though men fronted when targeting women, it was not as significant as the rate that women did it, which would match what you're saying, that those with the least power would have more variation, because this is considered already a community for men. Yes. So in a part of the analysis, I said that what men are doing, this is the norm for them, right? But women coming in, because women tend to do things in light of overt prestige, they will then conform to the linguistic norms of Jamaican dancehall, which is essentially a masculine community.
Yeah, but to add to that, you know, I hear what you're saying, but I think what is probably happening here, which aligns with what you have been saying, is that because dancehall is a male space, we could call it the homeland in terms of dialectology and geography. That's where you get the variation. So the sign that the women don't have a space yet is in that they don't show as much variation as the men, because they haven't conformed yet. And this probably provides evidence of what promoters and so on are saying that women can't do everything that men do, and it's showing in the vowels. Right?
And women have a way, I hear you, but women have a way in dancehall of rebelling against that because they've spoken about it. And this is why Spice took on the character of Splice a few years ago and said that maybe if I dressed and sounded like a man, I would get more respect. And she did that for a while, and yes. And Tanya Stevens said, when I go on stage, I forget about being female. I go on as one of the guys. So they're quite aware of the space that they are in, and they know that in order to get the respect that men have, they have to work 10 times as hard as any male in the business.
All right, but that's a study there. So you can now check Tanya to see if her vowels are doing
But I couldn't get in to all of that, but she was the one female in the study who did most of what men did in the production of vowels.
To comment on the question.
Sure.
The question, first of all, how do you separate the effect of the tune or the melody? Because you're talking about the fact that looking at the herbs, ultimately it's pitch, right? And so on. So the question is, if songs directed at females are generally higher in pitch anyway, then it will affect the vowels. Therefore, how do you abstract away the effect of the song or the melody from the vowels? Because it could be that, that songs that are directed at women may generally be more high-pitched, and therefore, understandably, therefore, the fundamental, the frequency of, what you're getting there is affected. So
Okay, so what I did, I looked for songs which had the monosyllabic words. In dancehall, there's a steady beat to the bass. And these line final words were the same in terms of length, right? So you would get man and me, and not necessarily me, right? So in that sense, I measured the center of the vowel, which according to, I can't even remember the author, but it's in my thesis, is the ideal point to capture a vowel that you're studying for acoustic analysis. So not the ends of the vowels that may be impacted by the consonants that surround it, but the midmost point of the vowel, which would, I think what they said, the vowel would be more still there in the center of the vowel. So that's what I made sure I'd read the literature to avoid this whole variation as the vowel being more, but I also looked at the words to make sure that they were in line final position, so they were short and not melodious. So it's more like a rap thing, like they were talking the vowels, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, but if I could talk it and end the line at me, or I could end the line at me.
I never had a case where I had a me, right? And even in that case, where if a man would go me for a man and me for a female, that is even still, that's still information showing that he's producing his...
No, but we wouldn't know whether in a melodic kind of situation, whether what you're getting is the effect of the melody or the effect of the actual vowel. It's not something that is easy.
It's not easy, and I agree, and that's why I decided to follow the literature and capture the midmost point of the vowel, which would be free of that type of variation.
Real talk. The other quick question, comment was that isn't there an interpretation that at least for some aspects of dancehall, what you have are men performing for a female audience, right? All the in other words, that the movers and shakers and the consumers of the songs about the girls and, how they're pretty and the this and the that. So you have male performers who are within a working class context. It is women who have money, not men, right? And that therefore you have men being paid by women to come and sing about them. And in that sense, yeah, man,
no, I'm saying interested. I've never really considered that aspect of it before.
Because you remember, particularly in the 90s, in the 90s, you remember the entire dancehall scene. It was women who danced. You remember it was Caroline and the whole pack of them. They were in front of the dance and they dominated that space. And it was men who were singing about them. So in that sense, you need, just raising that.
But in terms of the topics, though, men tend to sing more about badness and not being associated with issues homosexuality. So reinforcing their masculinity, a lot of the lyrics concentrated on that. You know, badmanism and being straight.
Okay, I'll switch, in interest of time, I'll switch my questions, because Prof teeth them, to comments. So, yes, I was wondering about audiences that the men are directing to, and, you know, so the one, for example, that you played with Beanie Man, I wondered, okay, is he just targeting this direct, so you have the direct hearer, and then you have the indirect hearer.
Oh, yes.
So those are two things that I would suggest you consider. And then
they were in the study, the type of addressees, the type of audience.
Okay.
Yes, so we had overhearers, direct addressees, and I'm trying to remember the other one. But we had different audiences. We did work that through.
And then I had a little bit about a question about the pitch that you measured, and I wasn't clear. Just a clarification question as to whether or not is it fundamental frequency you measured.
Yes, let me clarify that, because pitch itself cannot be measured. What was measurable was the FO, the fundamental frequency of the vowel.
Of the vowel, and you measured that in the middle.
Yes.
And I had this question about whether or not, so why the middle of the vowel versus the entire thing, if it's pitch versus if it's the F1 or F2 of the vowel, which would tell you what vowel quality it is. That's also a frequency that we're getting. So I was wondering how you made a choice between measuring format frequencies versus fundamental frequency.
I wanted to do consistent measurements because, I mean, there are a lot of things that I could have done, additional things, but to put that all in one study would have been too much. So I just decided to leave it at the midmost point and use the literature to support why I was using the midmost point for all vowels.
And then my last suggestion was that as you were talking about this again, I thought, how does what you found here match up with other kinds of discourses and other kinds of audiences? So, for example, if somebody is writing a poem for male audiences versus female audiences, or if they're talking, so how do the vowel productions match up with what you found in
terms of my data, or just generally? Generally, the literature showed that, as I said earlier, that women tend to lead in the fronting and raising of vowels, and these were not in musical lyrics because I couldn't find anything like that in music, for Jamaican. So I delved a lot in the international literature because most studies, variation studies involving vowels, were in regular conversations and not so much music. I don't think I found anything dealing with variation at the level that I looked at it, the acoustic variation of vowels in music. So I had to use regular language situations.
Thanks for this talk. Just a couple of things. I think that there is an intersection. Mine is quick. I don't have no more than one. There's an intersection here between audience design and style, and I really think I want to challenge this notion of masculinity that you're talking about, because if it really is about masculinity, then men talking to women, you should find right across the board. You shouldn't find the high vowels. So why would men use quote unquote women vowels, or do women kind of address women in this kind of way? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay, so that is why the production part of the study could not be the tell-all situation, right? So when I was seeing men using more back vowels when targeting men and more high front vowels when targeting women, I decided to look at the same vowels being used, no matter if it's back or front, high or low, and that's why I had to do the measurements, right? Looking at the same vowels being used by the same type, by men and women, and addressing the different audiences. So to look at what they do when the situation is the same to see if there's any variation, and that was the finding.
Thank you. Our second speaker for this morning hails from the University of Pittsburgh. Her main specialties include intonation, prosody of Creole languages, sociophonetics, sociocultural aspects of languages. And she has done work on various languages such as Jamaican Creole, Trinidadian English Creole, Belizean Creole, and Yami. Her topic for this morning is variation in voice stops in Jamaican Creole, implications for Creole development. Please welcome Dr. Shalom Gooden.
All right, thank you. So, many years ago, I stood outside in the corridor in a kind of silent, pensive mood, waiting to talk to Prof. Devonish again. And I had basically spent his entire day talking. And it was time for him to lock up his office and go home, but I was still wanting to talk. But he emerged from his office and he looked at me and he said, "You know, all can be healed, even a broken heart. I want to say thank you for your insight, for pushing me to question things and not to be afraid and to be uncomfortable with the unknown." I'm not sure why I'm doing this to myself, but my youngest brother should have been doing this with me. But even as I do this, I hear his voice saying, "Do your thing, sis, do your thing." So, inspired by Dr. Devonish, I decided to look at variation in voice stops in Jamaican Creole and looking at its implications, reconsidering its implications for Creole development. So the voice stops in Jamaican Creole are pronounced in different ways. And as Devonish and Harry in his work showed, that they can either be plain stops, plosives, or in some contexts, and we'll look at that later, they can be implosives. But how do factors such as speech context and phonetic environment affect their realization? And how does this variation, how can it be systematically patterned? Can it be systematically patterned? And I also want to think about the broader implications for this variation for phonological development of the language, considering in terms of formation. So discussions of implosives in Jamaican is grounded in theoretical debates concerning the sources of Creole phonology in general, and that the sound system of Creole languages can shed light on their diachronic development and also on the nature of Creole genesis itself. And I believe that filling this gap is important as if we are to fully understand how Caribbean English languages developed or have changed over time, we must go back to looking at phonology. And we've seen some hinting of this in the literature from previous researchers who encourage a reassessment of the theories of Creole formation guided by findings from phonological research. And that is different given that the bulk of the research so far has focused on morphosyntactic variation and on syntactic variation. So as somebody who's doing sociophonetic research and phonological research, I'm pressing towards that. So for example, in terms of my work on prosody, I've shown that phonological structure is, and I've argued, following Givan, that is vital to the development of new languages like Creoles, as it signals, according to Givan, the relationship between constituents before syntactic structures are even developed. And so if people are using that, then along with the prosodic structure, the phonology is coming with it. Thus, research on phonological systems of Caribbean English Creoles are crucial to achieving a thorough description of the languages and of their historical development. Irving tells us that phonology, and these are my emphases, is the aspect of language that is not reproduced in the written text. It's introduced in the school system, and it is the aspect of language that distinguishes the educated Caribbean speaker from his or her counterpart in the other parts of the English-speaking world. So the phonological identity of Creole languages like Jamaican has been the subject of debate for some time, and at the same time, it is very much under research relative to other areas of structure. As other cases of contact-induced change, some recurrent questions are, does the grammar of the emergent contact language consist of separate or coexistent linguistic systems? Are they a single merged system, or are the systems in which they are superordinate or in dominant linguistic systems as well as subordinate systems? So what I'm advocating for with this talk, and yes, I'm advocating rather than giving you answers, is for the type of empirical evidence that's needed to strengthen arguments of African substrate influence in contemporary phonological systems. The linguistic analysis itself provokes reflection on how forced West African migration to the Caribbean affects contemporary views and analyses of the linguistic systems themselves. So that the sound system of Creole languages can shed light on their diachronic development, as I've said before. It is well known that intense contact can lead to varying degrees of transfer from the source language to the recipient language. But this may result in a new system that is somehow a compromise between the two systems in contact. We do not know how much, if any, of the phonological system of the input languages were transferred to the languages in the output, but most importantly, what aspects, if any, have been retained by their synchronic phonologies. So for example, Smith and Van der Vaart in their work suggest that Suriname-type vowel systems can be found in Eastern Maroon varieties of Jamaican, like in Moortown. In Devonish and Harry's work, of course, they talk about implosives being in Jamaican. Implosives are highly marked sounds, and so understanding why they still exist, even in this allophonic environment that Devonish and Harry claim, are still very much important and still can speak to Creole development. So we need to understand the synchronic and diachronic rules, or roles rather, of phonetic cues to supporting phonological contrast. And we need to ask ourselves and figure out what is important in figuring out which parts are part of the system. And so I want to emphasize here that not because something is measurable and that we can see it on a speech spectrum or something means that it's a part of the phonological system. So what we have to do is to do the dirty work to figure out which part is just phonetic variation and which parts are a part of the phonological system. So which ones are the regularly occurring robust things that cue, place, manner, or phonation features in terms of production or articulation? Which ones are the acoustic properties, robust properties, that reliably signal perceptual contrast for native speakers? So what I'm going to be talking about is production, but I do not have the perceptual aspect of it, and what I'm pushing for and advocating is that this also needs to be done. So my end goal is to amass a large database of voice stops in different contexts by many different speakers, right? And I want to explore whether how these observations hold up and which ones are statistically robust. And of course, the perception studies to go along with that. So in the US where I work, everybody is talking about big data. And because I know that lots of us in this room have collected it, we kind of have big data already, but we have to put it in a format that it's ready to be used. So let's look a little bit closer at the proposal. So mb, nd, ng are allophones of voiced plosives, but the g, respectively, occurring in the onset of prominent syllables. However, languages manipulate air streams to affect the quality of speech, and what we're seeing here is a contrast or a variation then between sounds that are produced with a pulmonic egressive airstream mechanism so that the air flows out of the vocal tract. And the majority of consonants in the world's languages do this. The allophonic variant that Devonish and Harry claim are produced with a glottalic ingressive airstream mechanism. Air flows out of the vocal tract. And so comparatively speaking, these sounds are rare. So the fact that they show up in Creole languages kind of supports an argument for some kind of transfer effect. But I want to talk a little bit more about what these things are. So in implosives, it's the critical movement of the larynx downward rather than upwards that creates this effect. If the downward movement is sufficiently vigorous, according to Madison, air will briefly flow into rather than out of the mouth when the mouth closure is released. Most typically, the vocal folds are in the voicing position in the production of these sounds. But the research shows that there are languages that also have voiceless implosives. For stops, stops are characterized by gaps. So where this arrow is at this point. On the right is a voice stop, and right here is the murmur or pulsing that indicates that there's some voicing. And on this side, we do not see anything, and that tells us that we have a voiceless stop. Another thing I want to talk about is voice onset time. And this is the length of time between the burst release for the stop and the onset of vocal fold vibration. And that's also going to be important. Where do these sounds occur? Something is happening here that wants me to eject something. No. Go away, go away. All right. Languages containing implosives, according to Madison's research, the majority of them are along this belt here, which matches up with where a lot of the languages that were input to the Creole languages came from. So a red dot indicates a language with an implosive, and the purple dot indicates languages that have both implosives and ejectives. So the main point is that in this corridor here are where the substrate languages came from, and that is precisely the area of the world where Madison's research shows that you have a lot of languages with implosives or lots of languages with implosives and ejectives. So implosives are typologically rare and found in only 75 out of 567 languages in the world, so 13%. Many of these languages are found in this middle belt and include our Niger-Congo languages, Nilo-Saharan, and Afro-Asiatic languages. So together with this and their virtual absence from European input languages then suggests and support this idea of them being the most likely source. However, story come to bump. In Capo's research in comparative phonology, he says the entire Bay branch, which is the putative substrates for Jamaican, he claims that they have only plosives, not implosives, right? But there's a little bit of hope. Ladefoged and Madison suggest that these same languages have co-articulated stops which share some phonetic similarities, they claim, with implosives. So one of my grad students started looking at this in a class that I was teaching and suggested that if this is true, then there's a possibility that Jamaican could have derived or developed implosives from these co-articulated stops. Story isn't finished. There are some caveats. Descriptions of substrate languages are based only on 19th and 20th century text. So without speech recordings or other kinds of data from earlier periods, it is impractical, perhaps impossible for us to know for sure. But we can do some comparative data. In Saramaccan, contrastive distribution happens with implosives and stops at the same place of articulation. So it means that implosives in Strand, according to Smith and Haber's work, are phonemes. They suggest that modern-day Fang and modern-day Kikongo do not have implosives. But the historical linguistic work suggests that Proto-Volta Congo has been reconstructed with implosives. So they suggest that in the 1700s, Fon speakers who arrived to the New World had implosives and therefore would have brought implosives to Saramaccan. If that is true and those speakers came to Jamaica at around the same time, then we have another source, another avenue of the possibility for development of that for Jamaican. Implosives occur in other languages, so like in Sioux, in Austronesian languages in Taiwan. And I'm pointing this out because the study that was done by Fuller in 1990 found implosives. The one that was done in 1993 to the same village did not find implosives. In Papago, pulmonic egressive sounds are reported as normal speech sounds or the more general speech sounds, and implosives are reported only for female-to-female conversations. In Jamaican, we are seeing positional variation. We see that implosives happen in coda position, onset of non-prominent syllables, regular stops, and implosives occur in onset positions. And it's not clear if they occur in consonant clusters. In Harry's 2006 work, the only example of initial cluster with an implosive he gives is with a B-R, B-R, but in only example, one, so it's not clear if that happens. Added to this is some research on American English dialects that suggests that there are American English dialects that have implosives or implosive-like qualities. So some work by Tom Purnell and others in 2005, Jasowicz and others in 2009 suggests that North Carolina and Wisconsin dialects may have it, but what in their test, they show that only the North Carolina dialects had it. And a more recent study by Hussein and Hussein in 2017 went back and looked at some data from North Carolina, looking at Hickory English, and they found implosive-like qualities. So they don't have substrate effects. There are a variety of English spoken in the US. Implosives are where do implosive come from? So that's why I have it there that I'm now realizing this is more complex. So monkey another with time and telling swallow abe seed. Phonetic research is focused on articulatory, aerodynamic, and acoustic properties. The precise aerodynamic effects of implosive articulation appears to be more variable. So Ladefogel and Madison then suggest that what we have is a gradient continuum between voiced plosives and what they call true implosives, which in their production involve air sucked into the mouth at the time of the stop release. So this means analysis of voice stops in Jamaican is more complex and involves more parameters than it first appears. There is a great diversity in the production of implosives. Variability can be language-specific, speaker-specific, even token-specific, right? Variability can be in voicing, amplitude, degree of implosion, closure duration. What am I talking about? Here is a regular voice stop according to Hussein and Hussein's work. So the timing of this release is important. Here's an implosive-like quality. And the key feature there is the increasing of the amplitude from here up to the release, up to the burst release. And this is based on a measurement of air pressure in the oral cavity as is done like this, which I don't have that data, right? It's the data that we would need. So what I'm going to be relying on is that increase in amplitude, looking at the waveforms that I do have collected from spontaneous speech data from my dissertation research, also using data from Devonish and Harry 2006. So way back when I started this, looking at did some acoustic analysis and looking back at this data. So what I did is to find a language that has true implosives. And I compared waveforms, spectrograms, intensity, spectral slices, looking at all kinds of things. So I wanted basically to find out, what do these acoustic parameters look like? What does the waveform look like? What does the spectrogram look like? What does the intensity contour look like? What does the spectral slice look like? So here we go. So in Jamaican, citation form, baby, we see increase in amplitude. This is Cindy. Every time Jamaican is going to be on the left, Cindy is going to be on the right. Citation form, yes, implosive-like quality. Here it is in spontaneous speech. Doesn't look like Cindy. Here it is again from another speaker. Doesn't look anything like Cindy. Here's some data from Devonish and Harry. And all of these are citation forms, and they have strong sense of implosive-like quality. The amplitude is increasing from here all the way to the burst release. So good, citation form. So the waveform analysis suggests that what we have is a variation from increasing amplitude to slightly increasing or staying the same, or slightly decreasing or staying the same, depending on the context. Spectrogram analysis, we're looking for a voice bar. Here is JC, citation form, voice bar. Cindy on the right, voice bar. Good. Here it is for Bami Pressa. We have voice bar here, but the Cindy has more voicing in it when it's in context. So in all of these, we're seeing voicing, but one of the things that we see, in addition to the presence of the voice bar, is that there's greater amplitude or voicing around the Cindy that has the true implosives. Intensity. Here's the one for baby, again, in citation form, and it looks pretty much like Cindy, showing a rising in amplitude as you go towards the burst release. Here it is again for Bami Pressa, and here's Cindy on the right. It's rising, but doesn't have the same shape. So we have a steep rising in baby in citation form, and in Bami Pressa, it's somewhat steeply rising. Spectral slice. Jamaican on the left, and Hindi on the right. What we have to say about this is that the kind of, let me go to look at another one. Here is Bami Pressa, and here is Baru. And I have another one. Summary. When we look at the spectral slice, which is basically looking at a moment in time in the speech form and pulling out the amplitudes as a function of the frequencies, we see that forms like baby and Bami Pressa are more similar to the Cindy example, but Belly Woman isn't. very quickly, what I also found when I looked at the older data from the camp 1958, looking at a male speaker from Moortown, the speaker who occasionally switches into Chromanti, and I'm not talking about Chromanti, we pulled some examples from that. And we did some intensity comparisons. And speaker 2 is my Moortown speaker. Speaker 1 is from Devonish and Harry. Speaker 2, this is the older speaker, appears to have the highest intensity ratio, whether this ratio is measured using the stop, midpoint, or the stop onset. Speaker 2 also appears to show characteristics of implosives more than anybody else in the data set. One's from my data set, one's from Devonish and Harry. However, the word list data from Devonish and Harry consistently shows a high intensity ratio, and it consistently shows implosive type qualities throughout the data set, only for word list data. So, just to summarize then, implosives can occur word initially. However, in environments where implosives are predicted, word initially, and stress syllable initially, plain stops are often observed in the data more than implosive stops. Older speakers exemplified implosives in my data and in Cassidy's data. And so what I need is a lot more analyzed data. I need statistical analysis based on a larger amount of data in a lot more context to figure out if this is an instance of free variation or not. So only implosive B was found. I didn't find any D or G. However, again, more data. Future work should then investigate pre-voicing context in the environment, so maybe what we have is not a true implosive, but just pre-voicing, and to see whether or not, or how, or what affects the variation. So this is for you. Take 2 hands for clap. So I'm looking to see for you to volunteer to help me to code data. I need lots of help from people and students, and thanks. Yes.
Thank you. We open up the floor now for questions, but please remember 10 minutes, please. So we'd like to limit it to 1 question or comment per person. Thank you.
Who wants to know what free variation is? I'm not going to charge you for that one. But we're talking about simply variation in the language. So somebody can say butter, or they can say butter. Doesn't matter. So one of them was implosive, or tried for implosive, and the other one wasn't. And what we're saying is that you have that variation in the language, and it's not restricted based on gender or age or those kinds of things. It just really happens.
You can't predict it.
Right. Or it's not restricted for one religion.
Right. So I'm always fascinated by the data that is produced by the spectrographic machine and that kind of thing. So I have 2 questions. The first one was that you showed us an example of the machine that was used to collect data when it's an implosive. Could you explain, because it looks like a sleep apnea machine or something like that, what you showed us.
It's meant to induce sleep, so you don't know what the experimenter is doing.
So the first thing, could you explain exactly how that machine works? And the second one is directly related to the implosives now. When you say context, because the speech examples that you get, were the participants asked to produce these words just as standalone words, or was it from discourse? Was it from a longer stretch?
All of the above.
Both?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the definition of Harry data, you have word list data, right? So people have a list of words and they go down baby, butter, bulla, banana. And then you have a narrative, right? And then you have free conversation. All of my samples were either standalone forms, but no reading, so I elicited those and people would repeat them 3 times, or it's in elicitation frame or spontaneous speech. All of the Cassidy data is spontaneous speech data, so we had all of those.
Yeah.
And what we're finding is that for older speakers in spontaneous speech, we're seeing implosive-like qualities. But in the Devonish and Harry data, we're only seeing consistently implosive-like qualities in citation form.
Okay, so, and it's only voiced? Only for the voiced stops, like the b, d, and g?
Those are the only ones I looked at.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Right.
Okay, so for your Chromanti speaker, was the Chromanti speaker producing more implosives?
No, I never said he was a Chromanti speaker. I said he code switched between Jamaican and chromanti. I deliberately did not choose the chromanti sections of the data. That's for another kind of analysis.
No, I
another
don't.
time.
But did he produce more implosives than
Yes,
other
because he's an
persons'
older
sample?
speaker from a conservative rural area. So just like my conservative rural speakers in northwestern Clarendon, who also showed more implosive-like qualities, this speaker from Moortown also showed more implosive-like qualities.
Okay, that's interesting because as far as I know, modern-day Akan doesn't have implosives at all.
But at that, me
And,
say Capo find the same thing.
Well, for
Yeah.
Bay.
Yeah.
But Akan doesn't have the co-articulated stops. So that if we go with the claim of greater Akan, presence within Maroon communities, that this person who is supposed to have more Akan influence is producing more implosives, which is not associated with Akan, then something needs an explanation there. Yeah.
Right, and in Smith and Harbour, what they're suggesting is that even for their data, their input languages don't have implosives either. And so they kind of went to the historical data to looking at the proto-languages to see what's happening there. So it's a mystery.
Okay. Well, do you know if it is easier to get than to lose implosives? All right.
Very good question. Very, very good question. My language contact hat says it depends on where you are. Right, but but for a language to just derive implosives, we don't know. But then if we think about and that's why I keep saying implosive-like.
Yeah.
So if we look at the American English dialects that are said to have implosive-like qualities, and the basic point here is that when you're looking at the acoustic properties, it's more than just the rising amplitude. And what people are finding more and more is that the way in which these sounds are produced, it's very, very complex. It's not just one way. It's not just a matter of lowering the larynx and sucking in the air. You can do a whole lot of things. And even with just that one articulation, there's a lot of aerodynamic effects that can take place. So speaking of which, Clive had asked how this machine works. So it measures airflow in different ways. So you measure nasal airflow, you measure atmospheric pressure, and you also measure airflow within the production of the sound, right? And so the speaker is speaking into this, call it sleep-inducing device, as Clive puts it, while the person is speaking. And so you're able to measure the different kinds of air pressure and be able to decipher where the air pressure is coming from where. And this was done for a, So speech therapy, speech pathologists use these kinds of devices. And we get to hop onto the bandwagon and get to use it as well. I think Sylvia has a comment or a question.
Yeah, first a comment. The WALS map that you showed us is a map of languages in which implosives are phonemic.
Yes.
And so situations such as the one noted for Jamaican, if it can be demonstrated, would not, languages that have implosives in free variation or as allophones of regular plosives would not be in the map. Right, so that's one comment. The map is not a full representation of the distribution of implosives in languages around the world, just a representation of languages in which they're phonemic.
Right, that was the point of the map, to just show the ones that were phonemic and show that of the set of languages that do have it phonemically, it's a small set.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so and bare languages, for instance, the GB representation in writing is for an implosive. So the representation might actually be a little deceptive.
Right, so the research I referred to was not based on writing, it was based on acoustic phonetic research done by Ladiford and Madison. And so what they did is to go back and look at those co-articulated stops, and based on their acoustics, they're saying those are basically the implosive-like or implosive qualities.
Okay,
Good.
so now for the Jamaican data. So you offered pre-voicing, I think, was it? As a
as one thing to look at.
Right, and one thing that I noticed is that in recordings of some of my students, that voice stops are really voiced throughout, that you don't get the delay in voicing that you get sometimes in other varieties of English. So that's definitely something to look at, that interaction between voice and other aspects of the articulation.
Yeah, good, thanks. So yeah, so this whole bit here is what I'd be focusing on to see what happens in that bit. Because in American English varieties, based on recordings of some of my students that I took as well, what we find is this whole thing is flat, flat, flat. And only after the release of the you start getting voicing. So that's what voice onset time. Whereas from my recordings, even when I tested myself and looked at other recordings in my data, consistently, just like Sylvia is finding, you have voicing throughout the closure. So it seems like a subtle difference, but, and you know, I would like to do some kind of perception test to figure out, do Jamaican listeners, does it still sound like a stop for you if I wait or if I voice and then release it? All right, sounds like my time is up.
Thank you, Dr. Gooden. Our final speaker for this session hails from Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. Some of her specialties include environmental studies, African and Latin American studies, and she focuses specifically on understanding environmental worldviews in the Caribbean. Our topic for this morning is entitled, Where the Three Worlds Meet, Caribbean, Creole, and the World. Please welcome April Baptiste.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I really have to say that this project that I am going to be presenting, I don't have any visuals, so I'm just going to be giving a talk this morning. It really is a joint collaboration between Hubert and myself. Just a little bit of background. I met Hubert in 2011. I was already at Colgate, so I'm not a former student, though I feel like if I have been a student for the last 7 years. And I actually asked Hubert to be my mentor. I wasn't of that generation where, as assistant professors, we believe that we need mentoring. Did not have great mentoring because I did grad school in the US, and that's a whole different story. But I asked Hubert to be my mentor, and I would really say that he has been phenomenal for the last 7 years. I really do tell him that I got tenure because of him. If he wasn't there, I'm not so sure that I would have gotten tenure, and I might have had to move back, I don't know, to Trinidad and do something else more fun. But, you know, here I am. And the project that we're working on, I was speaking to Alison this morning, and she said that Hubert has this engaging enthusiasm. And so even though I'm not a linguist, as you all heard, I am working with a linguist on this project, and what we're really trying to do in this particular project is use my expertise on environmental perceptions, knowledge, and worldviews to be able to understand a little bit about Creole environmental worldviews. So it really is a work in progress. It's still rough around the edges, but hopefully this would be, the start of us talking about it, and then we'll get some good feedback from you all. So with that, I would say that the purpose of the working project is to examine the ways in which Creole culture and worldview is shaped as it relates to the environment in the Caribbean, and then extend this to other parts of the globe that may also experience a Creole identity. We know that the historical context of the exposure of the Caribbean region to colonization resulted in significant changes to the physical environment. This ranged from the dramatic increase in in forested areas to create plantations that drove the plantation economy. However, following independence, in many of these cases, we continue to see the physical environment being damaged with the increased use of extractive industries. So you can take, for example, oil and gas drilling as in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as tourism that we see in the Eastern Caribbean, even here in Jamaica. Using as a basis that the Caribbean region is central to the birth and growth of the industrial society, we're examining in this project the ways in which environmental worldviews are shaped and whether there is a typology of these worldviews. We focus on those that are considered indigenous, and I use indigenous in quotation marks because there are lots of definitions about how you define an indigenous population, but we are considering those that are indigenous to the region. And here, we started with the Maroon population, given their history of slavery and freedom, but more so, the importance of the physical environment to both their escape and their survival. So for this presentation, I'll be looking at one part of the research, which is the Motown Maroons in Jamaica, which I had the opportunity to visit when I did my sabbatical here in 2012. We started with this group, given the connections to the community from Professor Devonish's work on the Cromanti language and its use in both daily lives and cultural practices. But we also use seminal work done on the Motown population, such as the narrative written by Kenneth Bilby in his book, True-Born Maroons. What we attempt to do is to interpret the worldview via folk tales and similar cultural manifestations. We also use information gathered from interviews that we did with key elders and other members of the Motown community. We opted to use some key literature pieces to define what the elements of worldview is or should be. For example, Tolkien in 1996 does indeed suggest that the body of folk traditions of a community can be used to construct an image of worldview of that community. So what then are the elements of worldview that we're attempting to look at in this research? When we think about worldview, we are referring to a particular philosophy of life or conception of the world held by a person, group, or community. So worldviews have different elements as defined by a few scholars, such as Carroll 2010 and Johnson et al. 2011. Worldviews typically consist of 5 elements that we are attempting to look at in this project. These are the 5. First, an explanation of the world. Secondly, epistemology, what is true or false and how knowledge is obtained. Third, ethics, that is what is right or what is the right thing for us to do. Fourth, a prediction of the future of the world. 5, a theory of action, that is how do we attain our goals. And 6, etiology, which is an account of the building blocks of the constructed worldview. So basically, what are the origins of the worldview and how it is constructed. For this presentation today, in an interest of time, I'll really only present the first 3 elements of the worldview, just to provide an example of how we're approaching the analysis. So what exactly is Motown Maroon's environmental worldview? I'll start with an explanation of the world. The Motown Maroons expressly articulate a belief in a spiritual realm that has a direct impact on the physical world. At the helm of the spiritual realm is God. So in the Cromanti language, the word that is used for God has some underlying meanings. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the word because I will butcher it and Hubert will then shout at me after. But it means God. So the word for God, it means God of both heaven and earth, with there being a potential hierarchy, right? With the ultimate superior being of heaven being put first, and then earth coming after that. Additionally, other words that have been used for God indicate that there is a supreme creator and father, alluding to the notion of provision, possibly even indicating some patriarchal sentiments in the belief. I'll even put the caveat here that we have to probably examine this a little bit more because for those that may not be as familiar, within the Motown community and their tradition, they have a matriarch, which is Nanny. And so to be able to bring out these patriarchal elements, I think we have to kind of consider how that juxtaposes with this prominent female leader of the Motown community as well. The spiritual realm is further populated by spirits, both good and evil, as well as the spirits of deceased ancestors, who must be appealed to and satisfied in order to bring about positive results in the physical world. They believe that the physical environment is created and sustained by a spiritual being, and as I mentioned, in this case, it's God, but that the ancestors in the form of spirits are also agents of protection of the physical environment as they live in the elements around us. And so the ancestral spirits may also take on form of natural elements, right? So these could be things like animals, you could have fish, snakes, birds, and you hear lots of narratives surrounding that. And secondly, the ancestors can also be reborn as a new child, and this is one way of knowledge being transmitted or retransmitted, and I'll come back to that in the second point. So in summary, the explanation of the world for Maroons see it as the following: that God is a supreme being, God is the ultimate provider, with recognition that the physical environment is the source of that provision. Spirits are then substitute to God. They are both good and bad, and in some cases they relate to the ancestors that have passed on. And spirits exist either as elements of nature or they can be rebirthed as persons. But spirits have the potential to cause harm to the living, and that is central in thinking about how the world, the physical world, operates. The second element of worldview is epistemology. This is defined as what is true or false, and also, more specifically, how knowledge is transmitted and what is the source of knowledge. So for Motown, knowledge is transmitted from old to young, from an older living person to a younger one, or from an ancestor to a living person. When living elders transmit their knowledge to another living person, they can only do so in a limited way until that person is chosen by ancestors to receive more. So this is talking about the idea of how do you get knowledge, knowledge which is considered to be something that is not entitled, but something that is really special in the community. Knowledge, as Mr. Bernard, an elder in the Motown community, explains, ultimately comes from God. So it goes back to this idea of the importance of this supreme being. However, it is implied that this knowledge is transmitted to humans through spirits. Full disclosure of knowledge only happens under special circumstances, in that a person must have the gift of the language to speak to the spirits through dreams in order to acquire the knowledge. An element of knowledge that relates to the environment is the fact that a lot of the special knowledge surrounds the use of herbs, they usually refer to it as bush, either for healing or for ritual ceremonies. Within the Maroon worldview, there is special attention that is given to knowledge as it is seen as a source of power. When a person acquires it, they must deal with it responsibly, otherwise there would be a serious negative consequence. This relates to the third element that I'll talk about today in the worldview construction, which is ethics. Ethics is defined as what is right, or what is the right thing for us to do. It deals with the principles that govern the way in which knowledge is acquired and used within the population. Since the ancestors are the purveyors of knowledge, and knowledge is power, the living Maroons must be guided by certain principles in how they access and use knowledge that will satisfy the ancestors. Failure to follow these principles results in dire consequences. One of the principles is the ethic of chamu chamu yetu, which means talking about some things and leaving some things out. This is partly because knowledge in general, as mentioned before, is not seen as something that is entitled, but something that is earned, and so not everyone will receive all knowledge at once. The second principle is that you must have knowledge in order to receive more knowledge. So there is an underlying tone that a person has to seek out the knowledge first, gather some, and then they will acquire more. Part of seeking out that knowledge may be seen maybe through the idea of being cunning and knowing how to acquire that particular information. Going back to the idea of how knowledge is obtained for Maroons, there seems to be a belief that when instructions are given by ancestors, that these are followed as given without deviation. This is another ethical principle. Additionally, the knowledge, especially regarding the use of special herbs, must be done only for the purpose that was outlined or specified at a particular moment. It cannot be used without a request or for wrong motives, as this would lead to consequences. A fourth ethical principle is that knowledge is not free, but it is up to the seeker to give something in return for that knowledge, and that's usually referred to as eyesight. What is given is left up to the giver's conscience, but there cannot be selling of knowledge. Again, if you sell knowledge, it is seen as you being greedy and not seen as being ethical. A final ethical principle is that there must be a sacrifice for knowledge. Here, there are stories among elders of the community indicating that holding a certain amount of knowledge is often seen as a burden because they are expected to use it responsibly, and this is seen as a sacrifice as you're expected to be in good standing with the community, something that not everyone welcomed with open arms. So now there are three other elements of worldview that we're working on, and I'll just summarize them really quickly rather than going into details. The first is a prediction about the future, and here we are attempting to understand how Maroons view the future and also tie this to environmental threats that the community has faced over the years. So there are current stories of environmental threats, from the poisoning of fish to using harmful fishing strategies that are of concern to the community. Secondly, we also have to look into a theory of action, that is, how do they attain their goals? So here we are attempting to determine how they achieve their goals with respect to both protecting and transmitting their knowledge. In terms of the environmental piece, the question is, how do they use the physical environment as part of their ultimate survival? So for the Motown Maroons, we see that their action is grounded in the essence of ethics and how knowledge is obtained, that is constantly referring and deferring to the ancestors and satisfying them with sacrifices, purity, discipline, and ethical conduct. And the final is etiology, which is an account of the building blocks of the constructed worldview, that is its origins and how it was constructed. It is an understanding of why things are the way that they are. So why is this significant? We are hoping that in constructing the worldview of the Motown Maroons, we will provide a basis for understanding how groups begin to think about the physical environment. This may help us to understand how the physical environment may be used, threatened, etc. It may also assist in understanding perceptions, which is where my area of expertise lie, to broader environmental problems that the society is facing. So again, while this is still a work in progress, we are hoping that it will form the basis for understanding other societies, both within the Caribbean and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. We now welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you. Most interesting talk. I'm interested in the transmission. You know, in northeastern U.S., they say the Cabots only talk to the lodges and the lodges only talk to God. I was wondering if the ancestors talk to the elders, or they are equally accessible to everybody.
Hubert, I'm going to answer this, and if I say the wrong thing, please correct me, because he really is, you know, my mentor with respect to this. From my understanding, the ancestors speak to the elders, but it's also chosenness, right? So you have to be chosen in order to receive the knowledge or to receive the information. So not every single person in the community will ultimately be able to speak to the ancestors. I remember when I read Bill B's book, he talked a lot about the grandfa and the Cromanti play, and the grandfa being that in the grandfa, right? Okay, the grandfa being the individual who will be that person to be able, they don't use the term incarnation, but that's the closest that I could come to it. That is the individual who is able to channel and be able to call on the ancestors, and they have their libations and all their particular rituals that have to be done. So from my understanding, it's very much ancestors exist, they're there, you can call on them. But you have to be an elder in the community with a special privilege to be able to do that. So if I go into the community And even if I spend a large number of time there, I may never be able to call an ancestor I'm also not Maroon. So I don't think that could work.
So you started off in your presentation by saying that you're not a linguist.
I'm not.
But listen, what you're doing is important work. And, there are interesting interconnections between what you're doing and what we study in linguistics. And I could tell you that earlier this summer at the Society of Caribbean Linguistics Conference, there was a group of presenters who are doing marine conservation. And one of the things that they did as a part of their project was train, I can't remember the particular territory, but they trained the residents there in their native language to use conservation techniques in that community because of the problem of overfishing. Now, my only skepticism with that approach is that in many ways, overfishing as an environmental threat wasn't something that was possible in those indigenous communities before things like capitalism and that kind of thing, right? So here we have a US group coming to teach these indigenous members of a community what a problem that in essence might have been their own creation, right? How to solve a problem that might have been their own creation. And I'm wondering if you think that something like this is a potential issue that you might find in Maroon communities in Jamaica. I notice it in indigenous communities in Canada. For example, right? Those indigenous communities in Canada are yet to recover from colonialism, right? So they're plagued with alcoholism, high suicide rates. I mean, Maroon communities is different because we come from the plantation. We know hard life, right?
Right. Indigenous people
but it's true, right? So a lot of indigenous communities, for instance, in North America, are yet to recover from the effects of colonialism. Their worldview, their livelihood, and everything has been interrupted by European intervention, and they're yet to recover. Do you think there's a possibility that there might be this kind of, I don't know, existential threat in our own Maroon communities? Given what they've gone through, given the fact that a lot of the Maroons, I imagine nowadays, are Christians. Fine, and Christianity has a particular worldview of what the relationship between man and the environment is, and it is one of dominionism, which is not the kind of African, West African aesthetic that the Maroons would have originally had. So, do you think there might be a threat in the way that the environment and the Maroons interact in the future because of this?
Yes, short answer, yes. But just to expand, you brought up multiple things, right? The first being this notion of that in the modern day environmental threats, we do have to take the historical the historical frame into consideration. And that historical frame is, yes, behind, I'll deal with the Caribbean, slavery, our plantation system, that decimation, and then, of course, colonialism, and even now, neocolonialism, industrialization, extractive industry, as I mentioned earlier, right? Tourism, just look at it. We're completely destroying the physical environment because we have to build our economies, and one of the ways that we build our economies outside of Trinidad and Tobago is by this mass tourism. Of course, Trinidad now has to rethink oil and gas, obviously, because of what we're facing there. So that has led to what we see today as our modern environmental issues. I think the Motown community, what they are facing environmental threats, right? Colonel Sterling talked about the poisoning of fishing, that the younger persons, it goes back to transmission of knowledge because they are not learning those traditional ways of fishing. They up to the fast buck or the fast dollar, and that means poisoning the fish so that, they're able to capture it faster, etc. So those are one of the things that we're seeing. So I do think, yes, that there is this threat. I think the other part to that I think is interesting is when you have the outsider coming in to train the very persons whose language basically has been lost because they're not passed down by oral histories or those kinds of things, to basically relearn their languages, right? And I think that in itself has some ethical complications associated with it because, as outsiders, we have created the problem and now we're going in and say, oh, look, you have to fix the problem, right? Even though you weren't the source. I mean, just think climate change into consideration. We in the Caribbean have to deal with climate change and we have to fix the problem that the Western world basically created for us. So I do think that it's a major threat. I think, however, I do think, in speaking at least to Mr. Bernard particularly, that there is an interest in sort of transmitting that knowledge, but because of these sort of notion that knowledge isn't something that's freely acquired, you have those barriers and those tensions to deal with, and I'm not so sure how do we deal with that, right? Like, how do we deal with those tensions? But thanks. I mean, like, I think that those were some really, really cool comments. Thanks so much.
I had a question that was related to environment as well, but the connection between environment and language. And I'm attuned to it because I have a colleague who works in Fiji, and what they're doing is tracking changes in animal and plant life ecology and looking to see where languages have disappeared. And one of the things that they've done is kind of did this nice overlay of the world map and basically, in short, showed that where we have this depletion of the environment, languages are dying out. And so what I'm wondering for the Maroon community, if you're seeing, if you or Dr. Davis are seeing any changes in the language itself as a function of the shift and change in the ecology.
You know, that's a really good question. That's where we started, right? Looking at sort of the spaces where these Creole languages are being lost, and whether that might have a relationship to environmental threats, environmental damage, etc. So we started there. We didn't get that far, right, as yet. But it definitely is one of the things that I think we wanted to look at, starting with Moortown and then thinking about the Saramacca in Suriname, and we mentioned something else, but I can't remember right now, right? But yeah. We did think about it, but we haven't gotten so far. And it's definitely the first thing that kind of got us thinking that there might be that connection that we might be able to look at.
Yeah.
Creative multi-linguistic, thanks.
Yeah, this is just a comment because you mentioned the issue of indigenous groups and maroon groups. And as you know, there's been a fair bit of litigation, certainly in this hemisphere at the Inter-American Court, on the rights and the duty of the state to protect the territorial integrity of indigenous groups. And part of that litigation has awarded those same kind of rights to maroon peoples. So if the group has to complain, though, that if their rights are violated and litigated, but in the litigation of, certainly in this hemisphere, Maroons and indigenous people are given those same kind of protections.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, it's a good comment, and thanks for clarifying that, because I think when I said I use indigenous in quotation marks, because there are so many people out there that may say that the Maroon, when we think of indigenous, we use this very narrow term of those that were here prior to anything else. Right? And I think that's a narrow view of thinking about indigeneity. And so now that we know that Maroons, and thanks for telling me that they can be classified under this category of indigeneity, I think that it really does raise some interesting questions as to rights and whether they are litigious. I mean, that would be something interesting. Go ahead, Hubert, and then that might be the last question.
So April, Addison was the person who put us onto the thing with the Saramacca that we were going to work on. So that's the connection. So the report that you sent me, right? Okay. So we have a chapter on the Saramacca issue. Right. But what the plan really is that we don't have the same access to the traditions of the Saramacca live. We have it through Richard Price. Yeah. But what we're trying to do is to start with the Moortown Maroons, where we have direct live access to real people construct a sense of what may represent this Caribbean worldview, then go to the litigation in the case of the Saramacca and the traditional stories documented by Richard Price and so on. And then we have a final bit on Trinidad and Mass and Carnival where the same kind of thing plays out. So we're trying really to find this sense of Caribbean worldview in relation to the environment by working through, starting with the one set of people that we have easy access to, which is the Motown Maroons, and then expanding it a bit further.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Here ends our first session for this morning. Thank you to all of our presenters.